Hey guys, Andy here from Mediocre Hobbies, bringing you a hobby tutorial. So this video is directed at all you guys out there who have heard people kind of blather on and on about wet pallets for the last couple of years. These things have become a mainstay in every hobbyist's arsenal, on Instagram, on all the YouTube videos, all that kind of stuff. So I thought I would show you guys how a wet pallet works and how to set it up and what its purpose is. This is a very basic wet pallet tutorial. It is for people who have maybe never seen a wet pallet before or don't really fully understand what the purpose of it is. And this video should help you guys get a basic understanding of a wet pallet. And by the end of the video, you guys should be able to decide for yourself whether it's something you want to add into your arsenal or whether you can live without it. So stick around guys, enjoy the video. Okay guys, the wet pallet that I shall be using for the video today is the Army Painters wet pallet. I got sent this one as a free copy from Army Painter, so thank you very much Army Painter for sending this one out to me. It is super helpful having a fresh one kind of to take out of the box and show you guys the full setup and explain the different bits and pieces that go into a wet pallet. Whereas the one that I personally use is this one. It's the Everlasting wet pallet. I had back there kickstarted years ago and I've been using this one to death ever since. So it will be hard to show you how to set this one up when it's already in full swing. So this is the box it came in. I'm just going to take it out and have a quick look at the different bits and pieces that make up a wet pallet. A few bits of paper from Army Painter explaining a few bits and pieces of their product. And let's get into the meat and potatoes of the video, which is the wet pallet. So this is their one. I haven't had a proper look at this yet, so this is literally a first time look for me and for you. I like the strap that helps keep the lid on nice and tight so that no moisture leaks out when you're not using your wet pallet. It has a handy compartment on top for storing a couple of extra brushes, so that's a nice touch. It looks like they're designed to hold the Army Painter brushes nice and snug. But of course it'll fit normal brushes in there as well. You just might want to have lids on the normal brushes so they don't rattle about and the bristles don't get mashed on the top of it. So maybe having their lids on would be kind of beneficial. But that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is to talk about wet pallets in general. So close up that lid for now and we'll go into the main part of it. So this is the main well of a wet pallet. As you can see, it is completely empty right now. It's the other box that adds all the extra bits into it. So this box set will contain two different things. It will have a hydrofoam kind of a sponge sheet type thing, and then it will have sheets of grease-proof paper basically. Wet pallet paper is just grease-proof paper, the same kind of stuff used for baking and stuff like that. So to set it up, it's very simple. You grab one of the hydrofoam sheets, crack that open, and put that into the bed of the wet pallet. I didn't have trouble opening it there. I swear I didn't try and rip it open all manually like it and realized there was a little pull tab you just tear away. But anyway, it's basically like a really thin sponge. It's quite soft, quite malleable, and it just fits into the well of the wet pallet. This is the piece of material that will hold all of the water, and this is what I'm using here. This is just a bottle of normal water. I just like saving the Vallejo bottles, everything for airbrushing, because they're really useful for that. So all I'm doing is squirting and filling up the well with water. The sponge will soak up the moisture, so don't just give it a quick splash over the top. Make sure that you give it a really good soaking, because even right now you think that wet pallet is fully soaked, but you can see the water being absorbed and there's no water around the sides of the wet pallet. This means there isn't enough moisture in it. So once again, you're going to pour more water around the side, slosh it around, and you basically want to keep doing this until no more water is being absorbed by the sponge. Then you'll know that it's basically moist enough. Next thing we're going to do is take out a sheet of the grease-proof paper. This will allow moisture to come up through the sponge onto the pallet and basically keep the paint nice and wet, but it will not let water molecules pass through. Now that sounds kind of bizarre. So it's not going to dilute the paint on the pallet. It's just going to keep it kind of viscous and stuff like that. Like I said, I'm not a science man. I don't know all the correct lingo as to why these things happen. I'll just explain that they do happen and what the benefits of them happening are for you. If there are people who want to comment down below the correct terminology of all this, then of course feel free. So as you can see, I just waited until the grease-proof piece of paper has settled itself, and then I made sure that it's nice and flat on top of the piece of foam. Now, as you can see, although that piece of paper is moist, it's not wet. I put a dry finger, rubbed it across, and there's no moisture on my finger. So it's not allowing water particles to come up through, which I think is super important. Okay, now I'm going to show you the main advantage of using a wet palette. So I've got one of the standard normal palettes from Games Workshop. This is a great tool. I use it all the time. I still use it for things like contrasts and washes. I'll explain the difference between why I do that and why I don't do that with the wet palette in a minute. And what I do is I'm going to put a blob on the wet palette and a blob of paint on the normal palette, and then I'm going to leave it for 10 minutes. Just going to let it sit there, and then we're going to see the results after 10 minutes of what the two blobs of paint act like. Really quickly, the reason I don't add contrast and shade to the wet palette is they don't like water. They act bizarrely, they kind of separate and stuff like that. They much prefer the same consistency they have out of the pot, or you can add some kind of actual contrast medium into it to thin them down, not the wet palette. So here's the blob of paint on the normal palette after 10 minutes. And as you can see, it's quite lumpy, it's quite dry. There's like a skin over the top of it of dry paint. And I would immediately just consider this unusable. So I put this blob of paint on my palette, and then obviously I went away to make a cup of tea or whatever, answer the phone, and I came back and I found my paint like this. I would just discard this blob, and then I would go and get a fresh one out of the pot and then work from that. This would be wasted paint. And obviously a lot of us, especially newer people to painting, are going to be a little bit slower. So using the same color paint is going to happen for more than 10 minutes at a time. So you're going to have to continuously take more and more paint out of your pot to keep your painting process going. That doesn't happen with the wet palette. Same amount of time left, and as you can see, this paint is still completely liquid. It's still really strongly pigmented. As you can see, the paint is not getting any weaker as I move across the page with it. It's a strong, solid red coat. The reason I bring that up is I'll show you now on the dry palette once again what happens if I just try and add a little bit of moisture to the red paint, and you'll see what happens. Just really quickly, I like to overemphasize this. Dry finger, rubbing the pad. Once again, still a dry finger. So you're not diluting the paint, you're just keeping it nice and moist. So like I said a second ago, I'm going to get a fresh blob of red paint and apply it to the dry palette, or normal palette, I guess. And then I'm quickly going to add some water to it. Obviously the water will help with it drying in, but what you are doing is you're diluting the pigments in the paint. So as I go along, kind of creating a box of paint, you can see that on the left hand side of that box, the paint is the strongest because that was the first stroke, and as I work my way across, the paint is getting weaker. That is because the pigment is diluted and you've actually weakened the color. This isn't happening on the wet palette because we are not introducing water to it. It is saying it's a strong, regular color. So there's loads of different advantageous points to this. Like I said before, you can use that same blob of paint for a long period of time, and it's not going to change color across your miniature. So if you apply that paint to a model, if you add a touch of water to it, it dilutes a little bit, then you apply it, then it's going to be a slightly different color as the undertones are going to show through differently, and it's going to be a disaster. So here's an example of how it works for painting a miniature. So I'm adding some Sons of Horus Green from a wet palette straight onto this miniature. Sons of Horus Green isn't a particularly strong color, so usually it's difficult to apply, especially if you thin it down with something like water. Whereas with the wet palette, this goes straight over. This is one coat. It gives a nice, solid, highly pigmented coat across the armor, and it's fantastic. One of the other really powerful things about a wet palette is your ability to mix paints. Obviously, if you mix paints on a dry palette, you've only got a certain amount of time before that mix kind of dries out. Then you have to remix the color, and remixing the color over and over again is going to cause you to have different tones. If you have 60% green to 40% red, and then the next time you accidentally get 50-50, suddenly the colors don't match and it's a pain. Whereas if you do it like this, that color is going to be on that palette ready to rock and roll for hours. It'll allow you to do the entire job you wanted to do with that mixed color. One of my favorite points about using a wet pallet is the ability to seal it up and close it away. So I put the lid back on, put the strap back on, and then I can leave this for a couple of hours, even overnight, and then come back to it, crack it open, and that paint is going to be still usable. So here I've left the paint for an hour. I wish I could have left it overnight for you guys, but I'm trying to get this whole video done in one day. And this is the result after an hour. So that square of red that we did the test on is a little bit drier. As you can see, it's still malleable, but obviously you can't work with it. But the blobs of paint are still perfectly usable paint. I love this fact. It means that for anyone who doesn't have a lot of time to paint or constantly has to stop, you know, you've got kids at home or anything, and you got to get up and get them a glass of water, you got to go and do this, you got to go and do that. Just pop your lid back on your palette, go and do whatever bit you need to do, come back, crack open the thing, and get straight back into painting. No need to pull out more paint and try it all over again. I think this is one of the best uses of the wet palette. Hopefully this has shown you guys a little bit more about what a wet palette is for and how it works. If you did find it useful, make sure that you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions about anything I've done here, please don't hesitate to put them in the comments below. I will get back to each and every one of you guys. Thank you guys so much for watching till the end, and I'll catch you in the next video.